12 Economics. Please welcome Mr. Mhlomo. I'm here today to take you on macroeconomics. The topic we are doing today is international trade under macroeconomics. So subtopics in there are demand and supply reasons for the international trade, the balance of payment and its components, the foreign exchange market. Please join me and the team. Let's see what we have for you. The lesson will be very much helpful to you to prepare for any upcoming assessment. These are the lesson objectives. Firstly, the lesson will assist or help you to be able to have a detailed discussion of demand and supply reasons for the international trade. Remember, this is an essay according to our latest examination guidelines. You will be able to discuss balance of payments and its components. All sub-accounts will give you more details in order for you to be able to answer any possible question in your assessment. We will also correct the balance of payment disequilibrium. Also, the effect of changes in terms of trade and its calculations. You will be able to calculate terms of trade, factors influencing terms of trade, and then you will also be able to calculate terms of trade. You will understand more about the foreign exchange market, where we talk about mostly the currency, the appreciation, depreciation, devaluation, revaluation, overvalued currency and undervalued currency. Also some measures taken by the state and the Reserve Bank to stabilize the currency if ever it's unstable for the economic conditions. It is believed that you already know the following. As for the topic, taken from grade 11, effects of globalization, the causes of globalization, absolute and comparative advantage. These are the basic concepts that will assist you to go in line with me and understand this lesson. The international trade. Remember, this is the exchange of goods and services between world countries. The appreciation of the currency. It is the increase in the value of the country's currency in relation to another country's currency due to market forces. The depreciation. This is the decrease in the value of the country's currency in relation to another country's currency due to market forces. The exchange rate. Exchange rate is the currency of one country in relation to another country's currency. Terms of trade. Terms of trade refer to the index of export prices to the index of import prices, or you can say refers to the ratio of export prices to the ratio of import prices. The balance of payment. This is known as a systematically book of records that keep all international transactions of the country. Special drawing rights. This is an international reserve asset created by the International Monetary Fund to supplement the official reserve of its member countries. We continue with the terminology. Devaluation. This is known as a deliberate move by the central bank by decreasing the value of the currency in order to make exports cheaper. Revaluation. This is the deliberate move by Reserve Bank by increasing the value of the currency to make exports more expensive or competitive in the global market. Overvalued currency. This is the currency that is too strong for the state of the economy. Undervalued currency. This is the currency that is too weak for the state of the economy. The International Monetary Fund, IMF. This is the international organization that helps its member countries with the balance of payment problems. So our terms and concepts have ended. Now we are starting the main thing, the international trade. We are giving you the brief description of what is meant by the international trade. Remember, the international trade simply involves the exchange of goods and services between world countries. Across borders, if countries are exchanging goods and services with one another, we regard that as an international trade. So why are we having this international trade? It occurs because of scarcity of resources Some countries are having a surplus of production, some countries are having less of production. Some countries are facing supply constraints or challenges. Therefore, to reduce the scarcity of resources, the international trade or global trade occur. So, who promotes or which organization is responsible to promote the international trade? It is promoted by World Trade Organization. And then this kind of trade is having a very huge impact on the exchange rate of the country of different world countries, also on the balance of payments for different world countries, including the terms of trade. Because if countries start to interact with one another, there will be the exchange of currency, there will be the demand and the supply of the currency that affect the currency, that also affects the balance of payment of the country and also affect the terms of trade of each country. So these are the demand reasons for international trade. If you come across this kind of the topic, it's very simple. You need to understand, why are we demanding goods that are produced by other countries? What might be a reason for us to demand those goods which are not produced by us but produced by other foreign countries? So we have the following in listing: the population size. Remember, the increase in the population simply lead to the increase in demand for goods and services. If ever the number of people in the particular country increases, then there will be the greater demand for goods and services. Therefore, it might happen that the local market cannot afford to supply all those goods that are demanded by local consumers. Then consumers will have to import some goods for survival. And then the size or the level of income. We know that if ever there's an increase in level of income, people end up demanding more goods and services. They're always tempted to spend. Basically, if ever GDP per capita increases, that leads to the increase in disposable income. As a result, with more income available, people spend. As they spend more on goods and services, they end up demanding some of the goods that some of them are not even produced locally, but they are imports. And then we talk about the wealth. We know that wealthy countries normally, they spend their income on luxuries, while underdeveloped or developing countries spend their income on basic goods and services. Some of those goods are imported, they are not produced within that particular country. Preferences and taste. Remember, people are having various or differing preferences. Some people prefer this, some people prefer that. At times, people will be preferring goods that are not produced locally. Remember, it goes with the lifestyle of an individual. So might be preferring goods that are not produced locally. Therefore, they will have to import those goods and services. And then consumption patterns. We know that the consumption pattern is not the same. It differs from a person to person, differs from a country to country. It based mostly on income. As we know that developed countries mostly spend their income on luxurious goods, while developing countries spend their income on basic goods and services. So, for you to simply understand or to remember this list, you follow the structure. We say people in Wheatbank prefer coffee. P stands for population. In stands for income. Wheatbank stands for wealth. Preferences stand for prefer. And then coffee, which is C, stands for consumption pattern. So these reasons will be discussed in detail. I was just giving you a summary. So the population size in a country determines quality of goods and services needed. Yes, if ever there's a population size increasing, that will inform the market how much of goods are demanded. It might happen that the market is having less productive capacity. Therefore, people will be in need of goods and services. What should be done? Goods should be imported. So they will demand goods that are produced abroad, not locally. So the increase in population size causes the increase in demand for goods and services in the economy. Yes, that is clear. If ever there is more population size increasing, there will be more demand for goods and services. In order to meet the local demand, local market should increase the productive capacity. So in order for the market to be able to supply demanded goods and services, what should be done? The local market should increase its productive capacity. If ever it is facing some challenges or constraints, what should be done? consumers cannot go without those goods and services. There will be a demand, or foreign goods and services should be demanded by consumers in order for them to satisfy their utility. So local suppliers may not be able to meet local demand as population size increases. That's a fact. That is caused by supply constraints or supply challenges. Because our local firms, remember, at times we are facing or we are having infant industries that are having less productive capacity and capital. Therefore, the increase in population put them under pressure to the point that they cannot afford to supply the local market as a whole. Then importation or the demand for imports will occur in the economy. This calls for local consumers to demand imports in order to satisfy their needs and wants, or to satisfy their utility. And then the second one is the level of income. We know that the change in the level of income affects the demand. As much as people are owning more money, there will be a change in demand. If people are having less money, there will be a change in demand. So an increase in per capita income results to more disposable income. If ever the per capita income or GDP per capita increases, there will be more disposable income that can be used. So as there is a more disposable income, consumers might end up demanding more goods and services, for which some of them are not produced locally, but they are imports. So in developing countries, there's a high demand for basic goods and services. So we mostly demand basic goods and services, but we demand lower luxury goods and services. So as we demand these basic goods and services, some of them might be imported because maybe the local market cannot supply them at the highest capacity. So in developed countries, they demand the most luxury goods. So maybe some of these goods that are luxurious are not produced in that particular country. So that means they will have to demand it from abroad. So they demand goods that are produced by foreign countries, which are known as imports. Increase in wealth. We know that the change in wealth for each country will always change the demand for goods and services. So an increase in wealth of population leads to greater demand for goods. Automatically, as much as there's a greater demand for goods, some of those goods might not be produced locally, might be produced abroad, so they will be imports. So local consumers, because of more wealth, will demand goods that are produced by other countries because they have more wealth, they are affording, so there are no constraints on their side. So people have access to credit and can spend more on luxury goods, and then many of which are produced in other countries. So that leads to the greater importation or demand for goods that are produced abroad. Wealth creation increases affordability, which creates a desire to import. If ever there is more wealth being created, there will be more demand for goods because people will be affording. Therefore, some of those goods demanded will be imports because as much as the wealth increases, even the lifestyle for people changes. So they start adopting the foreign style, meaning they start importing goods and services that are luxurious. Preferences and taste. We know that we differ in taste. So we prefer different things. As much as we prefer different goods and services, some of those goods might not be produced locally. They might be produced abroad. So we are pushed to demand goods from foreign countries. So we know modern consumers have a variety of goods, of needs and wants, as well as preferences. Not all goods wanted are produced locally, therefore some must be imported. That is to demand goods that are produced abroad. Countries trade with other countries because they have a demand for goods that they are incapable of producing. So we demand goods from other countries because we cannot produce those goods and services. Therefore, that simply stretches the demand. That goes with the preference. It goes with the lifestyle of an individual. You are in need of something that is produced in US. It is not produced in South Africa. What should be done? Because there are no restrictions between South Africa and US, we will be able to import that particular product that you need in South Africa. That is to demand the product produced in the foreign country. So the difference in consumption pattern is determined by the level of economic development of the country. If ever within the country we have this stratification or division of some rich people and some people that are in the middle or at the lowest, what happens? Some people will be in demand of goods that are produced abroad. So they will be importing the most or demanding goods that are produced by foreign countries. While some people will be in need of goods that are produced locally. For instance, South Africa, we are facing the situation of huge inequalities. There are very much rich people very few people are rich. They are owning more economic resources. Those people normally, they prefer demanding imported goods. While the people that are underprivileged, are pushed, they don't have a choice but to demand the locally produced goods and services. Basically, those are basic goods for living. And then consumption patterns. Like I've said before, underdeveloped nations have a high demand for basic goods and services, while developed nations have a high demand for luxury goods and services. So the consumption pattern differs based on the development and the growth of the country in terms of the economy. So well-developed nations have high demand for luxury goods, and then that improves their living standard as they have more money to demand those goods and services. And then we move to another side now, which is opposite. Supply reasons. Why are we supplying other countries? Or why are we being supplied? Why do we supply other countries with some goods and services? Remember, each country is having its own good that is able to produce as compared to other countries. Each country is having its own absolute advantage and competitive advantage. Each country is having its own specialization in particular goods and services. Therefore, we know that if you are specializing or you have a specialization, what happens? You produce more goods and services at the short period of time, at the lower cost, at the right quality, and at the right quantity. So, these countries find themselves having surplus production. If we talk about surplus production, we talk about the country that is able to do what? To produce goods and supply the local market. After that, have a surplus or extra remaining production. Then that kind of production will then be supplied to other countries that are facing challenges of that particular product production. So these are the supply reasons. We talk about natural resources. We all know that natural resources are not distributed equally across the world. Some countries are having more of some natural resources, some are having less. Then what should be done if a natural resource is much needed? Then a country with a surplus will supply those countries with the shortage of that particular natural resource. Climate condition. We also know that climate condition differs from a country to country. This one is natural. We cannot influence it. If ever a particular land does not favor the growth of a certain crop, while the crop is necessary worldwide, the country that is capable of producing the crop should do what? That country should be able to have a surplus production and supply countries that are having less of that particular crop. Labor expertise. If we talk about labor expertise, we talk about the labor that is well trained, skilled, and educated. Remember, those are people that are able to produce more goods and services at a short period of time. At the same time, those people are able to produce more goods and services per unit at the lower cost. So they can produce more with less inputs. So they can be able to produce as much as possible goods and services in the economy. That will lead to them being able to supply even the global market with extra goods and services. Technical development. We are living in this world of technology. So we know that some countries are very much advanced in technology, while other countries are not advanced, they are very much lower in terms of technology. So what happens? Countries with advanced technical development supply those countries that are very much lacking in terms of technology with those technological gadgets and information basically, so that they can be able to live on. And then we talk about specialization. In this case, we simply refer to a situation whereby the country have chosen a particular product where it's capable of producing more of the quantity at the good quality and also at the lower cost per unit. Also at the short period of time, the country decides to specialize. It chooses a particular product where it can be able to do the most as compared to other products that the country can be able to produce. And then we talk about the capital. We know that countries with capital are always advantaged because they own these machines which are necessary for production to take place. So in case the country does not have a capital, that country should be supplied with the capital or the final goods that are produced with the particular capital needed, like South Africa. South Africa does not have proper machinery required to process their raw materials such as minerals or gold. So what should we do? We simply supply US with what? With the gold as a raw, and then we have to be supplied, or we demand what we call the finished product of the gold. Then that is because we don't have machines or capital which is necessary to convert or to transform our natural resources into finished goods. So in order to remember this list, we simply say rich countries like to send chocolate. That is taken from the mind again. Rich countries like to send chocolate. That makes you to easily remember the list that I've just provided. So in details, remember this is an essay again under international trade. Natural resources. So remember, natural resources are unevenly or unequally distributed across the world. Some countries are rich in some particular natural resources, while some countries are poor. Remember, natural resources are provided by nature. So if ever you are not favored for them, you will need to get them from the country that is favored for them. So you can't do anything around that. It's the matter of demanding from the country, or it's the matter of supplying the country that is having a shortage. Because if you have more of natural resources, like South Africa are rich in minerals, what do? We supply countries that are lacking or that are not having those particular natural resources. So this is determined by geographical area. The area itself and environment determines which natural resource will be available in the particular country. And then they have excess supply for natural resources, for which some countries have excess demand. One country might have excess supply, one country might have excess demand. The one with the excess supply must supply the country that is having excess demand, so that there will be reduced scarcity of resources in the economy. So in order to reduce scarcity, favored countries get a surplus extraction, collection, and cultivation of resources and supply in the foreign market. So those with the surplus production will always supply those with less production in the international market. So South Africa is rich in minerals but does not have oil. So what do? It then exports minerals to earn foreign exchange, which may be used to pay for oil imports. The climate condition or the climate change. We know climate condition differs from a country to country. It's not the same. Some countries are having the weather condition that will favor a certain crop production, while some countries are having a certain environment that does not favor a certain crop. So what should be done? Because they need that particular crop. They should be supplied, because the country with the surplus production is having more, then it will produce more of the particular crop and supply those that are having the shortage. Climate conditions vary from a country to country, and that affect mostly agricultural produces. Good climate conditions are essential for agricultural production. If ever there's a good climate condition, there will be more harvest under agriculture. Climate variations favor some crops cultivation, which result to surplus production and global supply. Yes, if ever the climate condition or climate change favors a particular crop to be produced, the country will have a surplus production and the harvest. Then what should be done? That country will supply countries that are having a shortage of the particular crop, so that they will be able to reduce the scarcity of resources. So the differing climate conditions allow some countries to grow certain crops. This means that other countries have no choice but to import that particular product, as for it's not suited for their what you call the climate condition. So that is it about the climate change. The main thing is it differs from one country to another. A certain geographical area is favored for a particular crop production, while another geographical area is favored for a certain production of the crop. Therefore, what should be done? The country that is favored will always have a surplus production. It will supply its local market and supply the global market now, because it is having an extra production. So certain crops only grow under certain conditions, so can only be grown in countries where the climate change or climate condition is suitable. If ever the climate condition is not suitable, the country cannot afford to grow the particular crop. Technical resources or technical development. In this case, we simply talk about the technology. We know that the change in technology mostly it favors those first world countries that are very much advanced in terms of technological development. If the country is well advanced in technology, it produces more goods and services at the lower cost per unit. So that country will always have a surplus production because it's very much advanced as compared to other countries. Mostly, we talk about developed countries in this case. Some countries are technologically more advanced than others and can produce new and improved products at the lower cost. That pushes them to do what? To produce more goods and services because they can produce at the lower cost. So countries that are technically advanced than others have an advantage over other countries that are still using outdated technology. So countries that are using outdated technology will always produce less goods. Then they will undersupply their local market. Then the foreign market will supply them because they will be in need. Production process, the availability of equipment and machinery influence the supply of goods and services and increase the global supply. If ever the production process having machinery and equipment, that simply does what? It allows a particular country to dominate because it is having relevant machines that are suitable to produce more goods at a short period of time. Countries that are very much underdeveloped, they lack that technical development and they will always be supplied, especially at the higher cost, because they are lacking labor expertise. We know that labor resources differ in quality, quantity, and cost between countries. A certain labor of a particular country will be more productive at the lower cost at a short period of time at the good quality, while a certain labor will be less productive using high inputs or more cost of production will be injected. At the same time, there will be poor quality of the particular product. So some countries have highly skilled labor, well-paid workers with high productivity level, while some countries are having poorly skilled labor, unpaid, they are paid less, they are less compensated, and then they have less productive capacity. So those countries with more skilled workers, such as engineers who can manufacture sophisticated equipment and machinery better and cheaper. We have those countries that are having those people that are well skilled. They can simply produce anything possible technically, and they produce it at the lower cost. Those countries are standing to supply the rest of the world with those particular goods and services. Productivity levels are higher and their production cost is very much lower. So that gives them advantage to produce even more. So the more skilled, educated and productive workers, the more competitive the country will be. If ever the country is having more skilled labor, those skilled labor will be very much productive, and the country will be able to be very much competitive because countries are more dependent on the skill they possess. If the country does not have much skill, the country will be very much poor in terms of production, especially technically. Specialization. Remember, we said specialization is all about the country being able to produce more of the particular product than any other country in the world. So specialization in the production of certain goods and services allows some countries to produce them at the lower cost than other countries. So you are specializing if giving same inputs, you are producing more than the other country. You are specializing in that case. And then countries choose products which are profitable enough for them to optimally allocate their resources in order to specialize. They choose those goods that are profitable for them. They don't choose goods that are not profitable enough for them to allocate their resources effectively at the maximum level and efficiently. So specialization results to mass production. There will be large productive capacity, and then it will bring surplus to be supplied to other countries that are having less resources in order to produce the particular product. And this results to large-scale production at the lower production cost per unit and the good quality. If ever the country is specializing, there will be large production, lower production cost per unit, and the good quality. And then that particular country will be able to supply the global market with the surplus production it is able to produce. And then we talk about the capital. We know that the capital simply allows countries to be able to produce whatever they want at any time. Mostly we know that developed countries are always enjoying advantage over the developing countries or underdeveloped countries in terms of technology. developing countries are lacking technology, they are lacking machinery necessary to process their raw materials into finished goods. That's why developing countries find themselves being manipulated by developed countries. Remember, they sell or they export their raw material to those countries or first world countries at the lower cost. Because remember, these natural resources are having strategic value. They export them at the lower cost and import finished goods of those raw materials at the higher cost. So they are being manipulated. That's why there's always an imbalance in terms of trading between world countries. Due to lack of capital, some countries cannot produce all goods they need. Because they don't have enough capital, they may not be able to produce all goods they need. So they stand to be supplied by countries that can be able to produce those particular goods and services. As we know that some countries are using modernized technology, their industries are well modernized and economies with advanced machinery and equipment. So their factories are also at the highest level in terms of technology and the capital itself. But they cannot obtain this equipment because they lack financial capital. So in this case, nowadays most of industries are well developed. They use the latest technology. So some countries are lacking that technology. They're lacking those equipment that are necessary. So it will always be difficult for them to produce those needed goods and services in the economy if they lack that capital which is necessary in order to convert their raw materials into finished goods. So they tend to be supplied by those countries which are having most of the capital. So this increases the need for the international trade. Countries will be in need of one another because some are lacking something, some are having more of something. Therefore, this interaction is there to ensure, to close the gap, to reduce the scarcity between world countries so that this thing of poverty cannot last longer within the rest of the world. The second part of the lesson, we are about the balance of payment. We call it the BOP. This is a very interesting topic that you need to understand today. We normally say it's a systematically book of records that capture all international transactions of the country. So in this case, we are focusing on this. Any transaction that occurs between world countries will be recorded under the balance of payment systematically. If ever we import some goods and services from the particular country, the payment for those imports should be recorded as an outflow of money because, remember, imports are negative. If ever we export goods and services into the foreign market, what should be done? As we export goods and services, the foreign earnings or the export earnings, the payment for export, should be recorded in South African BOP positively as an inflow of foreign currency. So we are looking at those things. Any amount of money that is leaving or entering the country or flowing into the country must be recorded under the balance of payment so that we can be able to check the international competitiveness of the country. BOP is very important because it determines international competitiveness of the country globally. So this is our balance of payment. So it's been defined as a systematically book of records that capture all international transactions of the country. So transactions reflecting inflow of money into the country's economy are added. If ever there is an inflow of money from the global market or from the foreign market or foreign country, we add that amount of money. If ever there is an outflow of money from our local economy, that amount of money should be subtracted because the money is leaving the economy. So the balance of payment is used to measure the level of countries' economic international performance and competency. So we simply check economic of the country in terms of international competence and competitiveness. How competitive is the country globally? How is the currency of the country? Can it be able to simply improve economic components of the country? That will be discussed here in details. So, in the BOP, you will have a favorable balance of payment and unfavorable balance of payment. If ever it's favorable, we say we have a surplus. That means inflows are more than the outflows. We received more money in terms of the foreign currency than we paid out the South African currency. This indicates that inflow of money in a form of foreign currency exceed the outflow of money. that will give us the surplus on the balance of payment. This might be a result of more exports if ever the country have been exporting more goods and services, more inflow of foreign investments, and then more inflow of capital from other countries, also more income received, and also more income received for services as well as inward portfolio investments. It might be because of that, hence we find ourselves having the surplus. The favorable balance of payment results to stronger exchange rate and international competitiveness in the countries, of the country's corporations. Businesses or strategic industries of the country tend to be more competitive globally because we are having this favorable balance of payments. How about the BOP that is not favorable? So, in that case, we talk about the deficit. That simply indicates that the outflows of the local currency exceed the inflow of the foreign currency. This indicates that outflow of money in a form of domestic currency is greater than the inflow of money. We are paying more money out than we receive as a country. This might be a result of less exports than imports, and then less foreign direct investments, less capital transfer, less income received for services, and less inward portfolio investments. So the balance of payments deficit weakens the country's currency and result to economic instability. So the country becomes less competitive. So we have some sub-accounts of balance of payments, namely the current account, the capital transfer account, as well as the financial account. In summary, the current account is more about, or it captures income and expenditure, production, also captured services, as well as transfers. That's what is captured under the current account. Under the current account, we subdivide it into two parts. We talk about physical or visible or tangible imports and exports. And then the second part is about invisible or intangible imports and exports. So if we can start with the visible or physical imports and exports, we can talk about the likes of the merchandise export. Those are goods and services those are goods that are produced in South Africa and sold abroad. And then we talk about the net gold export. In that case, we refer to the gold, the difference between exported gold and the imported gold. Remember, South Africa is the most producer or supplier of gold. So in that case, our net gold is always positive. And then we talk about merchandise import. So merchandise export is positive, and then net gold export is positive, merchandise import is negative. We add the sum of merchandise export to the net gold export minus merchandise imports. After doing that, we get the amount that can either be negative or positive. If it's positive, it means trade surplus. If it's negative, it means trade deficit. So, you might be confused. Why we don't take a gold as a merchandise? Why is it written separate? Because both of exports and net gold exports are physical. Why don't we mix it there? No, remember the gold is very important in South Africa. Historically, the gold was used to determine the value of the currency. The country with more gold in the world used to have the strongest currency, and the country with less gold used to have the weakest currency. So, how did they do that? That was happening in this manner. Countries used their central banks to monetize the gold or demonetize the gold. If you monetize, you give the monetary value. Demonetize, you remove it away from monetary value. So they used to do that to measure or to determine the value of the country's currency. So the gold is written separate in the current account because of its historical value or historical importance. And then we go on with the invisible imports and exports. There we talk about income receipts. That is the income earned from South African factors of production based abroad. You talk about the payment for labor or compensation for employees that is situated abroad. We talk about that amount. And then services receipts. In this case, we talk about South African services that have been sold abroad. We talk about the likes of transport services, marketing services, insurance services, banking services, etc. Those are services. If they belong to South Africa, then they will be paid then we earn income on them. And then also, then we continue. We talk about income payments. In that case, we subtract that amount of money because it's the income paid out for the foreign factors of production. We talk about payment for services. Those are services that South Africa have imported and it have to pay for them. And then we talk about the current transfer. So, under current transfers, actually, it should be the net current transfer because we consider the following. We look at what? We look at amount of money that have been donated by foreign countries or given by foreign countries into South Africa, and then we compare it to the amount of money that South Africa have paid out as a donation or gift to foreign countries. Then the difference will be the net current transfer. So our current transfer is positive because mostly we receive those donations then paying them out. That will give you what you call the balance on current account that can either be negative or positive. If it's positive, it means the surplus. It means inflows are more than outflows. If it's a deficit, it means that outflows are more than inflows. So this is the information I've just presented to you. Current account is the balance of payment sub-account that capture transaction based on income and expenditure, production, services, and transfers. And then current account may reflect surplus if inflows exceed outflows of the foreign exchange. Deficit is reflected if outflows of the local currency exceed the inflow of the exchange rate, foreign exchange rate. The current account equilibrium is achieved if the inflow of the foreign exchange equal to the outflow of the local currency. Then we have the BOP or current account equilibrium. Current account has two categories, namely physical and or tangible imports as well as invisible or intangible imports and exports. So these are the components of the current account. Physical imports and exports, like I've said, merchandise export plus net gold export minus merchandise imports. Then what do we get there? The difference in there will be known as the trade balance or balance of trade. So if it's positive, we have the trade surplus, negative, the trade deficit. And then we continue, we take on the total and carry on income receipts plus service receipts minus income payment minus payment for services plus the current transfers. What do we get? We get the balance on current account that can be negative or positive, like I've said before. Positive balance on current account reflects surplus and negative reflect a deficit. The capital transfer account. So this is the account that simply captures transactions based on the movement of capital from one country to another. For instance, a South African person living maybe for 10 years to Brazil, that particular person will sell his or her own positions and transfer that money into the foreign country, which is Brazil, in a foreign currency. And then that's a capital transfer because the capital is leaving or flowing from one country to another. Also, a Brazilian person moving to South Africa will sell his or her own position and transfer money or convert the money into rands and come to South Africa. And then, what will happen in that case? There will be an inflow of money or of the foreign currency in South Africa. And then, what do? The inflow of that particular capital is added under the BOP and be labeled as what? As a liability. And then, if we are living with our assets in terms of money or of South African currency, that amount of money should be subtracted and be labeled as what? And be labeled as what? As an asset. Why do we call the outflow as an asset? You might be confused. And inflow as a liability. Remember, any future gain of that inflow of capital will be enjoyed back in the country of origin in future. If the person decides to leave the country after 10 years, that 5 billion he or she have brought in South Africa would have generated more money that he or she will be taking away to his country of origin. Same thing applies with our assets. As we have the capital flowing out of the country, the capital will be able to generate more money abroad and it will come back into the country in future as a person decides to return into South Africa, and that will benefit the country. That's why we call that an asset. Remember, asset generate the most. So we say capital transfer account, capital transaction, and grants relating to ownership of fixed assets. Debt forgiveness, the voluntary cancellation of all or part of debt obligation within the contractual arrangement between creditor and debtor. If ever you were owing a particular bank in a particular country, and then they decide to write off your debt, so that capital will be transferred because you had their capital. Now, it's no longer, you are giving it as a gift because in this case, you are no longer willing to pay, you had a bad debt. So we call that the debt forgiveness internationally. The value of the household and personal belongings, financial claims and liability of migrants. And then, grade 12, we still continue on the capital transfer account. Remember, before we went to the break, we simply spoke about what is recorded under the capital transfer. It is very important that you know that because in any kind of assessment or formal assessment, this might be asked. You need to know your theory. You need to own your theory. So it's very important that you know what is recorded under the capital transfer account. So the value of households and personal belongings, financial claims, and liabilities of migrants. For instance, there we say a South African immigrant to Brazil, and then the proceeds of belonging of the person will be sold, and then the person will be able to transfer that money into the foreign country or into Brazil. That will be a part of the capital transfer, or the Brazilian coming to South Africa. So the difference between the inflows and outflow of capital is regarded as a net capital transfer. So we simply say the inflows minus outflows, we get the net capital transfer in there. Inflows of capital is added as a liability or liabilities. And then the outflows is subtracted as assets. Remember, I told you the reason why. Assets, the outflow is called the asset because the future gain of this amount of money will be back in the country in the future and benefit South Africa. Liabilities, this amount of money is here to generate more money and it will leave in the near future and benefit its country of origin. So inflows are called liabilities because there is the information. Because any future benefits of capital flow back to the country of the capital. And then outflows are called assets because benefits of capital flows back to South Africa as a country. I believe now you will understand if you see this difference of assets and liabilities. Then the financial account, the longest account we have, it is having some sub-accounts. Financial account is the account that captures transactions based on all types of investment that flow in and out of the country. It includes the direct investment, portfolio investment, and other investments. Remember, direct investment is capturing transactions based on establishments or the purchase of businesses abroad. If you are buying the existing business abroad, you are investing directly. We call those foreign direct investments. If a foreign investor invests in South Africa by buying the business here, that is a foreign direct. We call those foreign direct investments. So remember, you start the company abroad from the scratch or you buy the existing. That is happening because the buyer or the investor is willing to be the part of daily operations of the business. If you invest directly, you will fully be involved in operations of the business. It's unlike the portfolio investment. Under portfolio investment, if the investor invests on maybe buying shares abroad or buying shares in South Africa, the person is only interested on gains or benefits of those shares. A person doesn't care, or investor doesn't care about being the part and the parcel of daily operations of the business. So, portfolio investment captures transactions based on the sale or the purchase of paper assets or shares or financial securities or bonds across countries. And then other investments, we call this one the residual account, because this one captures all investments that are not either a part of direct investments and portfolio investment, but they are investment. So those investments are captured under other investments. We call this one the residual one, or residual investment account. The inflow of investment is added, while outflow is subtracted. Investments that do not form a part of both direct or portfolio investment are regarded as residual and recorded in other investments. So this is the direct investment on foreign direct investment. We call them FDIs. Investors invest with the purpose of being involved in daily operations of the company with at least 10% control. So the direct investment include investment on real estate, fixed property. These include establishment of the company abroad. When the foreign investor invests by buying the company in South Africa, the investment amount is credited and be called a liability. And then if SA investor invests abroad by establishing the business or the company, the invested amount is debited and be called an asset. The difference between assets and liabilities is called the net direct investment. Then the portfolio investment. This is more about the purchase or the sale of shares, bonds, paper assets across the world, or financial securities across the world. In this kind of the investment, investors invest with a purpose of reaping returns rather than being involved in daily operations of the business. If South African investor buys shares in London Federal Bank, the amount will be subtracted as an outflow, and that will be recorded as what? As an asset. If the foreign investor buys shares in South African Reserve Bank, the amount will be added because it's an inflow and then be recorded as what? As a liability. The difference between inflows and outflows is recorded as a net portfolio investment. And then other investments. In this case, we talk about residual category that includes all financial transactions not included under direct investment and portfolio investment, such as loans, the currency and deposits that are made. An important category here is a short-term trade credit, which is used to finance imports and exports across countries. Any investment not in the category of direct investment and portfolio investment is captured in this category, which is known as other investment. Remember, it's a residual category. And then we spoke about having the BOP deficit, BOP surplus. All right, now, how do we correct the disequilibrium? So there are some measures taken by the government. So we talk about the change in exchange rate. We know that the currency can appreciate and depreciate, and that can make imports more expensive for domestic consumers and exports more cheap for foreign buyers. So the depreciation of the currency result to export becoming cheap in the foreign market, which will increase the demand for South African exports in the global market. That can improve the country's or South African BOP deficit. This has an effect of increasing volume of exports while increasing export earnings. Trade deficit will be reduced because of our exports are more cheap or affordable in the global market. Cheap export result to increase in demand for South African exports abroad, and that will automatically correct the BOP deficit. Expensive imports result to local consumers importing less of those goods and demanding the locally produced goods and services that might be cheap. So that simply restrict the inflow of imports and promote the outflow of exports. And then there are some long-term policies that are used by the government, namely the export promotion and import substitution. Remember, export promotion such as government incentives is applied to encourage production of goods and services that can be exported to the global market. That's when the government intervened by assisting local businesses through giving them production subsidies, giving them some incentive, and that are known as financial and non-financial incentives in order for them to increase their production so that they can be able to supply the global market. Export promotion policy increases the volume of exports and increase the foreign earnings from the global market. This increase local production and increase economic growth. Remember, the increase in exports automatically result to the increase or strengthen the trade deficit. Our trade deficit might be reduced because of exports are increasing. So export promotion creates good environment for local exporters to improve their international competitiveness abroad. So if ever there is export promotion in place, our local firms are able to be very much competitive abroad because government is in full control and supporting them to be able to compete openly in the global market, even though depending more on the government is the problem, but that will be discussed under the topic of export promotion. So high volume or level of exports decreases current account deficit. And then the import substitution. In this case, we talk about the policy by the government, whereby it ensures that some former imported goods and services are no longer imported, but they are produced locally by giving some subsidies and incentive to local firms that can produce that particular product. This kind of the policy can occur in two ways. It can occur voluntarily. Also, it can occur because the country is forced to simply substitute the product. For instance, if ever South Africa is sanctioned to import a particular product, it will be forced to establish the company or strategic industry to supply the particular product. At times, it will just voluntarily, whereby the country will choose not to import a particular product and produce it locally. So these restrictions include increased import tariffs, trade embargo, import quotas. So the government in this case put some restrictions in place to prevent import from flowing into the country so that those goods can be produced locally. So in that case, we talk about increased import tariffs, the trade embargo, even sanctions, as well as import quotas. That is known as being in control of imports, avoiding or preventing them from flowing into the country in large quantities. So the government gives incentive to local business to produce goods that were imported in order to reduce the volume of imports in promotion of local goods and services. By preventing import through the import substitution policy, that allows the country to have less level of import while it's exporting. That will also reduce the balance of payment deficit, or what we call the current account deficit or trade deficit. Interest rate can be used again by Reserve Bank. We know that the interest rate have a great impact on the demand in the economy. If ever interest rate is lowered, local consumers find themselves being able to do what? To get loans and import even goods and services from abroad. And then if they've been increased, and then what happens? Local consumers find it difficult to get loans because loans become expensive. Then imports will decline because level of income will not be at the higher level. So demand for imports might be lowered. That's why we say again, as we continue, if what you call interest rates are increased, that will attract investors to come and invest on buying shares in South Africa for greater returns. This increases the inflow of the foreign currency into the country's economy. When interest rates are reduced, the demand increases in the economy, including demand for imports. Are discouraged to invest due to lower interest rate they are very much discouraged to invest on those shares because they will be having lower returns. And then exchange rate control. That is when the government intervened by putting some regulations on domestic currency by ensuring that it becomes more restrictive. Whoever that is in need of the currency should apply from central bank and get that currency. So earners of the foreign exchange are compelled by law to hand it over to the central bank of the country. Those who require the foreign exchange must apply to the, from the central bank. And then the fiscal policy, we know that the taxation has a greater impact on discouraging imports or encouraging imports. Also, the government spending, if ever government increases spending, there will be more income available in the economy, which might lead to more spending, of which some goods will be demanded from foreign countries. The state can also lower imports, compete with successfully with local goods. Remember, if ever imports keep on being cheap in South Africa, our local firms will be affected negatively because now local consumers will be demanding imported goods and services instead of demanding locally produced goods and services. That will devastate our own firms. This may decrease productive capacity locally and reduce welfare due to job losses as well as less local production. So a decrease in terms of trade may be a result of change in import and export prices. A decrease in export prices, what happens? Welfare is lost because more resources were used to produce the bigger volume of goods that are exported into the foreign countries. So in this case, if ever there's a decrease in export prices, it might happen that when the firm or the company was producing those goods, it produced at the higher cost. Only to find that in that particular country where we are exporting now, the export prices are lowered, we might end up selling at the lowest possible cost because of maybe weaker currency. Then as a result, what happens? This welfare will be lost, earnings will be reduced. Increase in import prices. If ever import prices are increasing, that will mean imports will be expensive in South Africa. As a result, what will happen? They spend maybe less to produce more goods and services that will allow them to have more earnings from South Africa. So, increase in import prices result to lower terms of trade for South African firms abroad, because that means as they spend a lot of money producing, now they are selling at the lower cost. Welfare is lost because more resources were used to produce more units of exports to finance higher cost of imports. And then changes in imports and export prices. If export prices rise relative to import prices, there has been improvement in terms of trade of the country. A unit of export buys relatively more imports of the country. Generally, this leads to an improvement in living standard as imported goods appear cheaper in South Africa for our local consumers. If import prices rise relative to export prices, there has been a decrease in terms of trade of the country. Generally, this leads to the decline in living standard of the foreign as the foreign earnings are relatively less and imported consumer goods are more expensive, so people tend to afford less of those imports. What influences terms of trade? The exchange rate. If ever the exchange rate or the currency is appreciating, that will increase terms of trade. But if the currency is depreciating, that will decrease terms of trade. Remember, appreciation leads to our export becoming more expensive or competitive in the global market, but depreciation results to our export becoming cheap in the global market. And then the competitiveness of local firms abroad. How competitive are they? So, export prices will be affected by the cost of raw materials and productivity. If ever we produce at the higher cost, there will always be that challenge. If we produce at the lower cost, we will always be trying to increase those prices abroad. So, if ever we produce at the higher cost, that will always affect our terms of trade. We continue with the factors. Relative inflation in different countries. We know that inflation will always lead to the depreciation of the currency. However, in the short run, it will lead to more foreign earnings if ever goods are sold at the higher price. Higher inflation would cause, at least temporary, improvement in terms of trade as export prices would be rising faster than import prices. However, inflation is likely to cause depreciation of the exchange rate, which will cause exports to then fall in prices. If the currency appreciates, what happens? Appreciation of the currency makes export more expensive and imports more cheap, that will increase the terms of trade of the country. How do we calculate terms of trade? We say terms of trade equals to the index of export prices divided by the index of imports prices times 100/1. These are the terms of trade indicated here. So let's see. Here number 1, index of export prices is 102 and the index of imports is 98. Then we calculate, we say 102, which is this one, divided by 98 times 100, we get 104. Those are terms of trade. There we go down there. Year number 2, index of export is 94. So if you can check, the index of imports is increasing, index of exports is decreasing. This one is going down, this one is going up. Then as a result, what happens? Our terms of trade will decline as a country, because as we do this, year number 2, 94 over 100 times 100, we get 94. So in that case, our terms of trade are declining from 100 to 94. There you go. And then year number 3, our export prices are declining again, 92, and then import prices have declined from 100 to 99. Then year number 3 is 92 over 99 times 100 equals to 93. Our terms of trade are declining as a country again. Year number 4, our export prices have increased over import prices. 105 export prices, 103 import prices. Then they will increase. 105 as export price divided by 103, which is import price, some 100/1, we get 102, which is the increased terms of trade. So you must be able to calculate your terms of trade in case you come across the data response in any kind of assessment that will be coming on your way in this year of 2022. So be able to calculate, be able to explain the effect and know the content and the theory. Then now the fourth part of the lesson is the exchange rate systems. Remember, we said exchange rate is the currency of one country in relation to another country's currency. So various countries are having different exchange rate systems. We have the first one that is known as the free floating exchange rate, which is the exchange rate that is free to appreciate and depreciate without limit because of market forces. So in that kind of the exchange rate, there is no government intervention to influence the value of the currency. We have the managed but floating or controlled exchange rate. That kind of the exchange rate is also determined by market forces. However, the government intervenes to set minimum and maximum limits. The currency can appreciate but not beyond a certain amount. The currency can depreciate not beyond a certain amount. So that is the controlled or managed but floating exchange rate. It can float but between limits. Maybe the government can say South African rand against US dollar. The rand, if ever the rand is appreciating, it can only appreciate up to 7 rand to $1. If it's depreciating, it can depreciate maybe up to 12 rand to $1. So it will float between 7 rand to 12 rand. That's why we say it's floating, but it is managed, it's not freely, because there are some boundaries that have been predetermined by the government. So then we have the third one, which is known as the fixed exchange rate system. This is the exchange rate system that remains constant for the given period of time. We say it is pegged, doesn't change for the given period of time. This one normally will only be influenced by the government through devaluation and revaluation. It does not appreciate and does not depreciate. Now, the appreciation of the currency. Remember, we say it gives the strength or the value into the country's currency as compared to the relative currency. If two currencies are compared, the appreciation of one currency means the depreciation of another. As one currency appreciates, one currency will be depreciating. Remember that. In comparison, as one currency gains the strength, another currency will be losing the strength if they are compared with one another. Appreciation of the currency is good for export and bad for import, because remember, if our currency appreciate, our rand appreciate against the dollar, our exports will be expensive abroad. And as South Africans, we will afford more of US dollars at the lower cost. That means as our currency gains the strength, their currency is losing the strength. Their imports will appear more cheaper locally in South Africa. Appreciation is caused by, remember, the excess supply or the decline in demand. If ever our currency is oversupplied in the global market, that means our currency will be strong. If there's an excess supply of rands, in the foreign market, our rand will gain the strength. And then if ever there's a decline in demand for rand in the global market, our rand will gain the strength. So keep that in mind. The main cause of the appreciation is the excess supply of the domestic currency. Then our currency can appreciate. What are the effects of appreciation? As the currency appreciates, exports become expensive or more competitive in the global market. And then what happens, as exports become expensive, they have a short-run effect of increasing the exports earnings. Remember, if exports are expensive, that will increase terms of trade. However, in the long run, that might have a negative impact because they are expensive. Then, if those exports are very much elastic, those foreign consumers will end up neglecting our exports and demanding their locally produced goods and services. Then the demand for exports will decline in the global market. That will be bad for our local producers that are producing to export goods into the global market. This increased terms of trade and welfare gain for the country. And then the long-run effect of appreciation is the decrease in demand for export depending on the price elasticity of demand for exported goods and services. This is what I was just mentioning before you came across this sentence. We continue with the effects of appreciation. Appreciation can result to the decrease in production of goods and services locally and decrease the country's GDP. Why is it happening like that? As our currency appreciates, exports become expensive. They might not demand it at the higher level. Therefore, the production will decline. Remember, imports are also cheap at the same time. Because as our currency appreciates, their currency depreciates. Then what will happen? As imports become cheap, local consumers might find themselves demanding more of imports because they can afford. And then appreciation has an effect of increasing the trade deficit and stretches the current account deficit. Yes, remember, appreciation is good. However, at times it's bad because as exports become expensive, there will be a lower demand for exported goods and services. As exports become lower demanded abroad, what will happen? That simply leads to what? It leads to less exports while imports are increasing. That will lead to trade deficit in our current account. This benefits local consumers as they get to choose from the range of imports at the lower cost while compromising local product because maybe local product might be expensive. If this is persistent, what will happen? Local firms might be more vulnerable and end up even shutting down because now imports are more cheaper, exports are expensive, local consumers are demanding imports, local firms are then vulnerable, they are not able to produce any further, then they might end even shutting down because of the appreciation. So, there are two graphs that will be displayed in front of you. Those graphs indicate what we call the appreciation. Remember, the first one might be the increase in the supply. Both of them are indicating the excess supply. If the supply is increasing more than the demand, remember the law of supply, it says, ceteris, other things remain the same. However, the higher is the supply, the lower is the price. So our rand will be sold at the lower amount where as compared to the foreign currency, or will afford the foreign currency at the lower amount. Let me correct that. We afford the foreign currency at the lower amount as the supply for local currency or South African rand increase or shift to the right. That will lead to our currency appreciating. Again, the second graph will be indicating the decrease in demand while the supply remains constant. So the supply remains higher, but the demand is declining. These are your graphs. Enjoy them as they pop in. That is our supply, that is our demand. We label the supply, label the demand for the foreign currency. And then that is the equilibrium being indicated there. So originally, our rand is trading at 15 rand is to $1. And then that is our equilibrium. So the supply of South African rands is increasing. As the supply increases, what will happen? We move from S to S1, and then the quantity supplied will increase now from 1 to 4. So we come across the new equilibrium, which is E1. And then what happens? Our rand appreciates from 15 to 12. That means now we can pay less to afford a single dollar. Now, that means appreciation. Remember, before you get confused, this is the appreciation because we use the indirect approach in this case of grade 12. As we deal with appreciation or the foreign exchange, we use indirect approach. This is an indirect approach. Indirectly, this is an appreciation. But directly, it will be a depreciation. But keep it in mind, we use indirect approach. And then you can see in here that the demand remains at D, meaning the quantity demanded here of South African rand is 1 unit at 15 rand. So what happens in the original equilibrium? The shift of the supply curve, the supply of rand increase from 1 to 4. That means the supply of rands is more than the demand for rands. We call that the excess supply. That's why we have an appreciation. Then that is indicating the excess supply of South African rand. There you see that area indicate oversupply of rands because the rand is lowerly demanded. That gives us appreciation of our South African currency. Then in explanation, you must be able to interpret your graph. At the original point, what happens? S is original supply curve, and then D, original demand curve. And then what happens? 15 is the original value of rand as compared to US dollars. And then 1 is the original quantity of rands, of dollars affordable with 15 rands. The point of departure, something happens, then the supply of rands increase from what? From S to S1. There you see supply increasing to S1. Remember, the demand for rands remain constant. So what is that supposed to mean? That means there's an oversupply of rand than the rand that is demanded in the market. So that leads to the appreciation. Then create the new equilibrium, which is E1, and the new quantity demanded, quantity supplied of rands is 4 units, while the demand remain at 1. That give us the appreciation of the currency because of the excess supply. Our rand appreciates to 12 rand. So we pay 12 rand to afford $1 now. The second graph that shows the decline in demand is being displayed on you now. That is our supply and demand, and then we are connecting our equilibrium. That is our 15 rand, and then we continue, that is the equilibrium. So there is a shift now. If the demand is shifting, what happens? A backward shift, new demand curve. And then, let's see. So, originally, we have supply, we have demand. The demand for rand decline in the global market. It declines to 1 unit. So, meaning they are only demanding 1 unit of what? Of what you call, of rands. And then how much are they capable to pay or are they willing to pay? They are willing to pay 12 rands. And then, the supply remains high in this case. You can see the supply remains at equilibrium. We are supplying 4 of our rands, but they are demanding only 1. So what are that supposed to mean? That means our rand is gaining the strength because it is being oversupplied in the market. There you see the excess supply of rands. That is the indicator. Explanation of the graph. Remember original point, like I said before, S original supply, D original demand. And then what happens? In this case, there was a shift in demand, a decline in demand. That have caused a certain shift. So this is 4 and this is 1. So the demand shift or decline back, that lead to excess supply, like I've said before. Interpretation, this is our original supply and original demand. And then originally, what happened? We are trading the rand at how much? At 4 units, 15 rand. And then the rand appreciate to 12 rand, and then 12 rand per unit. Then it becomes cheap. That leads to what we call appreciation because the supply remains constant or higher while the demand is declining. Remember, depreciation is the decrease in the country's currency in relation to another country's currency because of market forces. If the currency depreciates, it loses the value. In comparison, one currency gains the strength, one loses the strength. We have discussed that. Depreciation of the currency is bad for exports and good for imports. We know that if ever the currency depreciates, our exports will be more cheap and imports will be expensive. So the depreciation is caused by the excess demand. Keep that in your mind. If there's excess demand for rand, our rand will depreciate in the market. The effects of depreciation, we talk about as the currency depreciates, exports become more cheap and less competitive in the global market. However, they will highly be demanded. Cheap export has a short-run effect of increasing import earnings. This decreases terms of trade because the currency have lost the value. So terms of trade will decline because of what you call the cheap exports. In the long-run effect of depreciation is the decrease in demand for imports, depending on the elasticity. Because remember, if imports are expensive, that will lead to local consumers not demanding more imports because they are expensive, while our goods and services that are exported are highly demanded abroad. So effects are continuing. This can result to the increase in production of goods and services locally and increase in country's GDP because consumers might neglect expensive imports and buy local cheap products. Depreciation has an effect of decreasing trade deficit and strengthening the balance of payment. Remember, if ever the currency depreciates, our exports will be more cheap and affordable. That will lead to greater demand for exports in the global market and lead to reduced BOP deficit. So this benefits exporters because the demand for exports will be high or will increase. And then South African goods will be very much competitive, very much be demanded in the global market. If this is persistent, local firms might grow as their goods will be highly demanded in the foreign markets. However, persistent depreciation might lead to exports sold at the lowest possible cost than the cost of production. You find that the product was produced at 10 rand per unit in South Africa, but it's sold at 5 rand per unit abroad. So that now means it is too cheap, then businesses are not making any profits. So depreciation indicated by excess demand. There should be more demand of our rand than the supply. Then that will lead to the depreciation of our local currency. So let's see, that indicate the excess demand. There you go, excess demand. Originally, we can see original supply, original demand, but the demand increased to the left, move to D1. As the demand shift to D1, the rand is highly demanded in the global market or in the foreign exchange market. As the demand for rand increases, the supply for rand remain constant at 1. That means our rand will simply lose the value to depreciate. Remember, the law of demand says certainly pass. As much as other things remain the same. The higher the demand, the higher the price. The demand for rand increases, the rand loses the strength, it depreciates. And then that's an explanation of the graph coming in. The same graph is coming back, so we are indicating original points here. We can see supply original, demand original. That is our original equilibrium. And then the demand curve shift out, and the result to what? Result to the depreciation of the currency from 12 rand to 15 rand. Then our currency loses the strength. And then another graph indicating the decline in supply, because the first one was indicating the increase in demand. We are still on the excess demand for the currency, remember. So if ever the supply decline while the demand remains the same, that means there will be excess demand for that particular currency, and the currency will lose the value because the demand is more than the supply of the currency. You can see the supply is declining back there. As the supply declines, the law of supply will prevail, stating that steady pass. The lower is the supply, the higher is the price. Remember, the demand remains constant. There you go, and then our rand loses the strength. The rand was initially 12 rand, but now the rand is costing 15 rand per single US dollar. So that indicates the excess demand, because the supply is at 1 unit, but the demand is at 4. So there's an excess demand of this particular currency. Therefore, the currency loses the strength. The explanation again. Original points are mentioned. You can see S, you can see D, original equilibrium. And then trading at the 4 units are demanded and supplied. But then if ever the supply shift back or decline to S1, what happens? The rand loses the value from 12 rand to 15 rand per unit. That is known as a depreciation, and is an excess demand that is causing the depreciation of South African rand. So this is the assessment. In this kind of assessment, is from Western Cape. You are given the supply of dollars against South African rands. So let's see questions. What is the equilibrium quantity and then you have the answer is 12 million, and then remember you interpret each graph before you go to questions. What is the result of a decrease in the supply of dollar on the value of rand? The value of rand depreciated to 1 unit per what you call 1 rand is per what you call the $9 decreased or dropped or lost the value or was weakened. Briefly describe the term appreciation of the currency. The increase in the value of the currency against another currency because of market forces. We continue. What will be the impact of overvalued currency on the balance of payment? It can lead to continuous deficit on the current account. We have discussed that. And then why do some countries prefer fixed exchange rate? They are doing that in order to reduce uncertainties in the economy. It tends to avoid uncertainties with regard to exchange rate, prevent them from running out of the foreign currency. And then, remember, we have undervalued currency and overvalued currency. There is a situation whereby the currency can be overvalued. The currency can be undervalued. So, overvalued currency is the currency that is too strong for the state of the economy. Rand can be 7 rand equals to $1 instead of being 12 rand equals to $1. This currency is too strong for the state of the economy. It is overvalued. And then there must be the correction. What should be done? South African Reserve Bank increases interest rate to attract more foreign investments. If ever there are more foreign investment attracted, that will lead to what? That will lead to greater demand for South African rand for those investors. As a result, that will lead to our rand losing the value because it's overvalued. Increase in interest rate here indicated foreign investments on shares will increase, and then there will be excess demand for South African rand, and then the supply of rand remain unchanged or constant, then the rand will depreciate. That's what the Reserve Bank can do. And then we continue. South African Reserve Bank directly intervene through revaluation and devaluation. So South African Reserve Bank can relax exchange rate control, and then the demand for South African rand can increase. So they can relax exchange rate control to allow everyone to access South African currency. Government can decrease import restrictions, demand for South African rand so that it can increase for those importers, and then the demand might increase the supply of rand, and then the currency can depreciate. Stabilizing the undervalued currency. Remember, undervalued currency is the currency that is too weak for the state of the economy. Maybe the currency, our rand equals to 16 rand is to $1 instead of being 11 rand is to $1. So oppositely so, decrease interest rate to discourage those investors. If ever you decrease interest rates, there will be less investors on shares, and then the demand for rands will decline. As a result, the supply of rands remain constant, and the rand will appreciate because the demand have declined. We continue. South African Reserve Bank directly intervene through revaluation, giving the value direct, but this normally happen on the fixed exchange rate. And then South Africa buy foreign exchange to increase the supply of rand. So it will buy the foreign reserves and reserve them as it's increasing the supply of rand in order for the rand to gain the strength. South African Reserve Bank can tighten exchange rate control to make it not easily accessible in the global market. Whoever that is in need of the South African rand should apply in the Reserve Bank. Government increase import restrictions so that the demand for rand on importers can decline, which will release the pressure on the rand, and the rand can gain the strength or gain the value. Then our lesson ends here. I therefore thank you. I believe this lesson will have a greater impact on your preparation for any upcoming formal assessment. Enjoy your holidays. Thank you, Bob. Shine card. Yeah. Goes. But I must like down 70.
And exactly on 15:30.
Yo.